Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 120, 120. Oh my god, what have I been doing? But it's quarantine, so let's read some philosophy online. Yes, that's right, Philosophy Roulette, where we read random philosophy papers and review them live on air. You can send me one, please do. I appreciate it when I get suggestions. They are nice. But otherwise, I just go to new and I see what we have, or I just grab a random journal and see what that random journal has. Okay, Acta Analytica. We just did one from Acta Analytica. Let's take a look at this. Why not? I could always do another one. SBs. I don't know what that is. Let's go look at SBs. Maybe it's something interesting. European Journal of Political Theory. Also interesting. Humanistic Management. I generally avoid the 1 to 26. It's a little bit too long for this. That would take me about an hour and a half to read, which is too bad because this is, right, tell you the truth, this is like some sort of the historical stuff and logic stuff I like, but let's see, Frege's Begriffschiff, Peirce's Existential Graphs, Wittgenstein the Tractatus, Sentential Fragments of Classical Logic, just good old hardcore analytic philosophy. So much fun, so much fun. Let's see if it's available. Maybe I'll just like glance at it otherwise. This is called Notational Differences. Okay, not here though. Let's see, oopsie. You know what? Is there a link to it? Let's just see what the link looks like real briefly. But SBs, what is SBs? I don't know. A lot of short papers. That makes me think it's one of these double-spaced, double graphed. Contemporary aesthetic top. Alright, so whatever. I mean, from Thomas Kulka on kitsch and art into art as a singular rule. Arnold Gellin on about modernists. This is like some aesthetics journal or something. Aesthetic experts. Huh. I have no idea what this is. Alright, let's just see what these folks over here have. European Journal of Political Philosophy. Okay, something to like, maybe I'll keep it back in my head for a little light reading before bed, you know? Interpretation, let's see what that journal has. Okay, I don't know what SBs is, so this looks like, I don't know what language this is. Maybe it's Polish Journal of Aesthetics, if I had to guess. I mean, it looks like this one's here because it's got 36 downloads, but SK, so it's not, that's something else. Slovakian, okay, Journal of Aesthetics and Arts and Culture. And this looks like an open access, well, this is an open journal system, that doesn't mean it's open access, full text. Let's see. Yes, Creative Commons. Let's see what I've got. Okay. But I mean, that also means that all of these other ones, do I want to read one of these other ones? What do I care? They're all the same. It's all the same to me. I don't know what any of this stuff is. Contemporary, because this is an open access journal of Slovakian aesthetics. So, and then we've got European. I also want to look at interpretation. I think, is interpretation a nice journal? You know what? Let's do that one from SBs, because why not? Seems like a popular one. So, we're going to do Aesthetic Experts by Tereza Hadravová. I apologize to the author for how I say their name. And if you so choose to, if you're joining me live and you want to grab a link to this page and get the paper so you can follow along, or you're just interested, you can always come to the chat and type !paper in the chat box, and the link will pop back up, because when you show up, a lot of times the old chat isn't there. So, cool. Aesthetic Experts by Tereza Hadravová. Okay, Socrates. What about beautiful and ugly, good and bad? Theaetetus. Yes, these two, and all these, above all. I think the soul examines the being they have as compared with one another. Here it seems to be making calculation within itself of past and present in relation to future. Socrates. Not so fast now. Ha ha. Not so fast now. Oh, that Socrates is so funny. Does perception come before knowledge, creating its base, giving it an input, so to speak, or is it already a way of knowing? In the last decades, there has been a strong tendency in various theories of perception that have arisen after a sense datum theory was so thoroughly discarded to comply with the latter, although there has been no common theory of what way of knowing it is. If the perception of beauty is then regarded as a kind of perception, then against the backdrop of the prevalent general understanding of the terms in question, it should be classified as a kind of knowledge. Alright, so beauty, if perception is regarded as a kind of perception, then it turns into a kind of knowledge. Okay, interesting. But even for those who would side with the former say, as Socrates does in Theaetetus, that perception and knowledge could never be the same thing, perception of beauty seems to be a clear exception. Perception of beauty is, in fact, one of the arguments that Socrates uses to convince Theaetetus that perception and knowledge necessarily split, and thus knowledge is to be found not in the experiences but in the processes of reasoning about them. The so-called perception of beauty figures in the passage as an uncontroversial example of knowledge, showing that it is the soul that, by examining and comparing and making calculation within itself, sees beauty, not the eye. Both Socrates and Theaetetus finally agree that the so-called perception of beauty, contrary to normal perception, is the result of a long and arduous development involving a good deal of trouble and education. And the noticed contrast eventually forces Theaetetus to revise his original thesis, the one that Socrates disagrees with, that is, that perception and knowledge are the same. Referring to the text that is approximately 2,388 years old, in the essay on current trends in neuroaesthetics, might seem to be quite an anachronism. My main reason for using it is to emphasize that both general accounts of perception's relationship to knowledge, namely a perception equals to knowledge account and a perception is independent from knowledge account, classify the perception of beauty under the rubric of knowledge. In other words, whereas there is a tremendous disagreement about a question of whether perception is knowledge, the question regarding the perception of beauty seems much less contentious. One can, of course, argue against the prevalent answer, but then one needs to precisely argue the burden of proof lies with her. If, however, one has no intention to depart from the standard position and is happy with saying that the perception of beauty is, generally speaking, knowledge, as I am here, it seems... Why is there a comma there? Is that where it should be? I don't know. It seems reasonable to ask, what are the consequences? One of them has already been pointed to in the above quotation. Knowing goes hand in hand with learning. It involves a good deal of trouble and education. If one acknowledges that the aesthetic perception falls under the rubric of knowledge, one subscribes to the idea of acquiring it and supposes that there is a process that spans between not knowing yet and an accomplished mastery. There are concepts that one needs to be able to understand and apply, expertise being one of them. Okay, so I guess this is where we're going. That if you have to learn something to understand beauty, then beauty is not just given to us, and so there has to be experts at recognizing beauty that we have to sort of work to become if we want to recognize beauty too. Alright. The main topic of my essay is the concept of aesthetic expertise, which I will study in the framework of current visual neuroaesthetics. Do experiments and their interpretations, that is, the main methodological tool to build theories in this area, allow for aesthetic expertise, and if so, how do they conceive it? Who is the aesthetic expert, and what aesthetic mastery consists in, and how does one recognize experts according to research working in the area of neuroaesthetics? In a way, this inquiry may seem to be a continuation of David Hume's list of embarrassing questions, as he calls them. But where are such critics to be found? By what marks are they to be known? How to distinguish them from pretenders? Always a good question, Mr. Hume. How to distinguish, how to filter out the pretenders. Hume, with a palpable relief, reassigns these questions to the realm of facts. And where else to get any closer to facts, you may think, than with neuroaestheticians. Not so fast, though, as Socrates remarks in the opening quote. We should first look at whether the experts are being searched by neuroaestheticians at all. This paper has two main objectives, not objections. First, I wish to make a case against the idea that aesthetic perception is not knowledge that I found prevalent in the early days of neuroaesthetics, that is, in the period spanning roughly 10 years, beginning in the mid-1990s. The structure of the argument I used to support this claim has already been outlined. It is based on the need to justify such a claim by explicit arguments, and the lack of them. My second objective is to describe and assess a recent shift in methodology to what I regard as a more hopeful direction in research in neuroaesthetics. This paper composes of four sections. In the following one, I'm adumbrating the framework of the discussion, that is, the field of neuroaesthetics, and limiting the scope of my current interest. Then I focus on how experiment subjects were described in research papers resulting from the experiments undertaken in the early 2000s, and in the third section of the paper, I compare this description to the one based on more recent lines of research in the field. In the final section, I draw some consequences and suggest improvements of the prevalent research paradigm. Okay, so this is a search for neuroaesthetic experts, which is good. Not heard that this was a problem, but such as philosophy, lots of problems to be solved, and this is, I guess, one of them. Most of the philosophical reflections of experimental aesthetics have generalized from a few selected examples of neuroscientific studies. These, apparently, the usefulness of the neuroaesthetic project for such a philosophical aesthetics. Oh, studies neuroscience of, okay, whatever. Just hopefully good. More nuanced and extensive history of the field and the effort to see an inner development in the research methodologies and interests have been scarcely undertaken. This article aims at discussing one particular topic which is precisely located. The experimental aesthetics, as I consider it, is a subset of empirical aesthetics. Besides experimental aesthetics, empirical aesthetics involves approaches based on other ways of collecting data, for example, statistical methods or field research. In this article, I will limit experiments to neuroscientific laboratory experiments. More specifically, I am going to focus on the field of visual neuroaesthetics. Most of neuroaesthetics belongs to the experimental subset of it. Empirical aesthetics, that is, it involves an experiment which is performed in an artificial setting of a neuroscientific laboratory. A lab is characteristically equipped with some apparatus, that is, a brain scanner and computers that compute, translate into visual or digital terms, and show the results of the scanning. The machine is being operated by a scientist and his or her team. They give a subject some general instructions about the process and require behavior as well as specific instructions about the task which she is supposed to perform inside a scanner, if any. They also ask subjects to fill in questionnaires before and or after the scanning and to sign necessary forms of consent. They start and finish the scanning process and choose and control a visual stimulus that is being presented to a subject lying inside a scanner. Finally, they analyze and interpret the data they collected at the experiment. Each of the mentioned components and stages of the research paradigm can be discussed and evaluated separately. In what follows, I am going to focus on one of them only: experimental subjects. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, most of researchers in the field of I am not a PhD student, no. High law student philosophy, though. Welcome. Let me know if you have any more questions, and I'll try to answer them. I'm just some random guy who knows a lot of weird stuff. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, yeah, but feel free to ask any questions. Go right ahead. Most researchers in the field of visual neuroaesthetics intentionally recruited research subjects who had been untrained in the arts and did not have any pronounced interest in aesthetic matters for their laboratory experiments. For example, researchers focused on those who had no special experience in painting or art theory, who received no professional training in the fine arts, subjects with no previous training in art or history of art, or those who had no special experience in painting or art theory. Let us have a closer look at one of the studies you just mentioned. Silicon et al., who defined the perception of beauty. I'm trying to do public philosophy. The career in academia, if you know anything about the philosophy job market, is not exactly that's a rather unlikely career at the moment. What I am interested in is sort of public philosophy. So I am trying to do some public philosophy, and what does that mean? So I read these papers and I try to break them down, and so in some sense what's public in public philosophy interests me. And so this is sort of like the interaction of like doing philosophy. That's kind of what this project is about. And so this is sort of, yeah, I'm interested in public philosophy. Not necessarily online, but it's just where is the public of public philosophy. So yeah. So yeah, well, good luck with law school. I mean, we always need more lawyers. We do. Lawyers are okay. Okay. Okay, so Sila Khan et al., who defined the perception of beauty as the capacity of assigning different degrees of beauty to certain forms, colors, or movements, ask their subjects to perform aesthetic judgment task. They should decide whether each picture was beautiful or not beautiful, while presenting them with the set of 320 pre-selected pictures made in different styles and depicting various subjects, but roughly similar in their complexity, color spectrum, and luminosity. Under magnetoencephalograph, MEG, the research team took neuroimages of the subject's brain areas, aiming at locating those that were activated during the visual perception of aesthetic objects. Whereas the set of stimuli is described in a relatively detailed way, the images the team used had been selected in a special testing that predated the experiment itself, and they were then carefully homogenized. The experiment subjects are introduced very briefly. 8 female subjects, average 20 years old, were tested. All were neurobiology students in the Universidad Complutense Madrid with no previous training in art or history of art. All subjects had normal or corrected vision and normal color vision. All were right-handed. The experiment was approved by the Ethical Committee of the Comunitat Autónoma de las Islas Baleares, Spain, and all subjects participating in the study gave informed consent. Yeah, so this is the always the trouble with studies in like Western university in like the West. A lot of times, I forget what the term is, but the subjects are always like basically upper class white people, because that's who goes to school in the West mostly, and so it's always a problem that you don't know if basically these college kids you're using are representative of the rest of society or the world at all. Is this X-Fi? I don't think this is X-Fi. I think this is analyzing X-Fi in some sense. It says, well, what is the grounds for trying to find an expert in aesthetics? And so this is more of a question of the metaphysics of beauty and how we recognize it, and is there such a thing as a beauty expert in terms of aesthetics? So it's looking at the experiments that were done and trying to understand how they work. So, yeah, this is in an aesthetics journal. It didn't say it was an experiment. I don't think they did any experiments, but they're reviewing what people have done. Okay. The researchers do not explain or justify the subject selection, although in the concluding discussion they remark that several studies have confirmed the presence of a basic knowledge of art in participants with little or no formal training in the arts or aesthetics. Human beings seem to share a common denominator underlying all artistic experience. In the final paragraph, they add that the result of their experiment, that is, the aesthetic perception, is intrinsically related to the activation of the prefrontal dorsolateral area, deserves further study. In particular, it says it is necessary to understand how variables like artistic training modify the aesthetic perceptions. Thank you, law student. I appreciate it. These remarks indicate that researchers believe that aesthetic reactions of naive subjects to visual stimuli remain pure and unified in their crude form, and that is at least as long as the subjects have not been exposed to any training in the art or the history of art. More strongly, any education in the art Roulette's word in their terms impair the scientific results, since for the educated subjects aesthetic preferences are modified or biased, that is, they no longer exhibit the pure aesthetic reaction. From this reason, I suppose they did not think it necessary to explore what actually research subjects were doing in the MEG scanner while using their right hand thumbs to indicate that they were supposedly undergoing aesthetic perception. So, what actually research subjects were doing. So this, I guess, is like the question here. What actually were the research subjects doing? They were pushing buttons, but that's kind of odd. So I guess that's the way they're coming into this at. What the individual subjects were doing and for what reasons is, however, quite an open question. First of all, it is highly improbable that the subjects have not been educated in the arts at all, since education takes many forms, ranging from formal to a wide spectrum of informal ones. All of the subjects had been exposed to culture and aesthetic norms prevalent in their social context. Put differently, their past experiences with pictures and more broadly visual designs significantly influences the expectations they... Hey, what's up? Aristotle. Welcome back. I was talking to you last night. Yeah, I was talking about aesthetics last night too, and we're doing some aesthetics now. And I like that you use AFK. I want AFK to come back. I think AFK is a cool term. Okay. Put differently, their past experiences with pictures, or more broadly, visual designs, significantly influences the expectations they use to be able to appreciate the picture they are presented with in a particular moment. They are, as Plato said, making calculation with itself of past and present in the relation to future. Moreover, there are various competing aesthetic norms present in the society, and there is no guarantee that all of the subjects, not even that each one of them, have been consistently applying the same one in the scanner. It seems quite reasonable to expect that while color or composition was the key appreciative factor for some of them, the other ones were more inclined to focus their judgment on the presence of a specific topic, a female human body or landscape, for example, or the way of depiction, its realism, for example, etc. It is also highly improbable that different styles and different themes of pictures invited one subject to use different criteria across the testing. Yeah. But what if one claims that the neurobiology students at the University Complutense were so exceptionally ignorant about the visual arts and their appreciation that they just lacked any standard norms and criteria that they would use to answer the research questions? Would their aesthetic reaction be pure, unbiased, and supposedly homogenize them? Even if possible, this move will, however, hardly help us to get on a safer ground, since it is an open question, one that is strikingly similar to the famous Molyneux question: how such subjects understand the researcher's quest to perform aesthetic judgments in the scanner. Moreover, their aesthetic judgments were subjugated to some kind of training directly in the scanner, with more than 300 pictures being shown to them. They necessarily compared one to the other, while their discerning abilities might become more and more acute, or go more and more numb. If they lacked the aesthetic criteria before they entered the scanner, they surely had some at the end of the scanning session. Yeah, so apparently, if you're going to do this, you're not going to... Of course, there are no one in the world at the moment, or at least no one... Very few people... I can't see anyone in the world, actually, not having some sort of aesthetic enculturation. You're always going to start from your culture, and all the human cultures have visual arts and something like that. So without the history associated with each person, you're actually not really understanding. There is no, like, homogenized null state when it comes to aesthetics. So that's first, and then even then, this author is pointing out that since there were 300 pre-selected pictures, that is going to prime, like from the beginning to the end, is going to prime the subjects in a certain way too. For one way or the other, even if they're randomized, it's still going to prime them. So that is a second point. So it would seem that you can't get a homogenized, like, initial just like blank reaction, because over the course of 300 pictures, it's going to also affect how people react to things. Okay. The neuroscientists in question have not gone so far, though, since As is clear from one of their remarks quoted above, they believe that people in general share an aesthetic denominator and basic artistic knowledge. They must have been worried then that it is specifically formal artistic education which distorts one's natural and shared ability to judge visual stimuli aesthetically. The researchers must have suspected that if one was educated in the arts, that is supposedly trained in some artistic standards and knowledgeable about some aesthetic norms, one does no longer apply what she really likes, but rather what she is supposed to like. Yeah, so it's like, well, if you had everyone trained in one way, then you'd expect to get one result. But that's fair, but that's assuming that there is even some sort of standard that everyone would go to. Alright, yes, and as they say, the problem is real, but contrary to what neuroscientists supposedly fear, I think it turns up more intense at places where aesthetically naive subjects are being used. Subjects who have had only little or weak contact with the arts might be aware of their own limitations and as a result feel uncertain in basing their preferences in their feeling intuitions. If they are asked to make judgment or express their preferences, they tend to turn to where they feel the safest ground under their feet: tradition, canon, rules, and pre-established meanings. From the extensive literature on heuristics and judgment, written and inspired by diversity and Kahneman studies from the 70s on, one learns how unreliable and subjected to various biases people's normal reasoning, that is, reasoning under uncertainty, is. I suggest that feeling under uncertainty can display similar patterns or distortions. When one is not confident enough, he or she tends to discard her feelings and base her preferences on some easily available rule, such as, for example, more variety, better, or pick up the same thing as someone you admire. So, okay, so they're basically saying people are going to default to, like, standards when they don't really know what's going on. And so using people without training is just going to reflect the biases in their upbringing more than someone with training who would be trained to sort of understand the biases. That said, philosophers supposedly are very good at understanding biases, and we are terrible at getting rid of them. We are so terrible at that, and there's studies on that too. So experts aren't always less biased, but the point is a good one nonetheless. This is highly relevant for experimental research done with students, especially those whose aesthetic attitudes are uncrystallized or under construction. For an example, in a famous study called College Sophomores in the Laboratory, Influences of a Narrow Data Based on Social Psychology's View of Human Nature, published as long ago as in 1986, but still relevant today, David O. Sears argues that exploring opinions, attitudes, or preferences of adolescents or young adults faces generalization problems since these subjects tend to have a less fully formed sense of self, manifested variously in identity confusion and diffusion, inadequate integration of past, present, and future selves. They also have a stronger need for peer approval, manifested in dependency, conformity, and over-identification with peers. In other words, far from being clear or natural liking or preferences of aesthetically naive research subjects are ambiguous, subjected to a variety of influences, inclined to follow an ad hoc rule rather than a robust feeling intuition. To sum up, I assume that aesthetically naive subjects were recruited for the experiments in neuroaesthetics because of the worry that aesthetic reactions of artistically educated people are corrupted by their knowing too much about art. I argue that people who are not familiar with art are not safe from this worry. For what gets in a way of experiencing the artwork is not knowledge as such, but a certain way of using knowledge as a shortcut, so to speak, to a judgment. Okay, so this is arguing from the history of experimental psychology that the neuroaesthetic literature is sort of biased. Okay, but that's alright. So where are we going from here? The effort to keep the aesthetic reaction pure and natural, meaning untrained, unspoiled by knowledge, that I ascribe to neuroaestheticians in the late 1990s and early 2000s, does not have any counterpart in contemporary philosophical aesthetics. To my knowledge, for even those who take aesthetic properties or values to be directly represented in feelings of pleasure, consider, as Gerald Levinson does, the sensational model of artistic apprehension in which artworks become merely pushers of one's buttons, with the result in favorable cases of delightful tingles as simply inadequate to what transpires during most of our intercourse with art. It also goes almost without saying that the perceivers who can count on their pleasures in delivering aesthetic judgments are supposed to be competent and appropriately prepared, or suitably informed or appropriately primed. The prevalent choice of research participants in neuroaesthetics has recently changed, and some of the above objections have thus lost their point. In more recent papers, the subject description gets more volume, and the important part of it consists of the information about the arts-related education of the subjects. The comparison of professional or expert reactions or judgments to those of the so-called lay people has been a widespread method used in many, if not most, studies in visual neuroaesthetics in the last 10 years, regardless of the aims of or hypotheses of the research in question. Experts can be found in Kirk et al., all these people, and many others. In philosophical terms, what seems to be happening in visual neuroaesthetics now is a shift from what Levinson calls sensational model to what David Davies called enlightened empiricism. That's a nice term, Davies, enlightened empiricism. Let's have a closer look at one of these studies mentioned above. Kirk et al., who aim at discovering brain correlates of aesthetic expertise, in particular expertise in architecture, start with an observation that it is quite likely that art experts use different neural processes for determining aesthetic evaluation than non-experts. Well, this is actually very interesting. I mean, do different art expertise use different parts of their brain too? Like, do architects do something different than, say, painters? I wonder about that. Because if you get, like, different experts in different things, maybe they're using completely different parts of their brain. That would be fascinating. Okay. They focus on brain areas that have been selected by previous neuroimaging studies which explored brain correlates of aesthetic judgment, but they have not considered the impact of expertise upon the neural pronouncement of the judgment. Striatum, orbitofrontal cortex, and anterior cingulate cortex. The subjects whose neural activity was measured in a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner, fMRI, Western rate on a scale running from 1 to 5, that is, very unappealing to very appealing. More than 300 images belonging to two different subject categories, the images of buildings and of human faces, the latter being control group since it does not allegedly have any relation to the expertise in question. Interestingly enough, the results have not shown any significant differences in evaluation. The mean of evaluation was roughly the same for both experts and non-experts, as well as for buildings and faces pictures. The sole exception being a neutral value that was given to buildings significantly more often by experts than non-experts. So the experts have like a null, maybe. I wouldn't be surprised about that. That's kind of interesting, though. However, the brain scanning results confirm the researchers' assumption. The images of the selected areas of the expert brains showed significant differences both in the strength of the reaction and in the extinction across the engaged brain subareas. The description of the research subjects reads as follows. 24 healthy volunteers, 11 experts, 13 non-experts, 6 female experts, 7 female non-experts. Expert mean 30.8 years, non-expert mean age 27.2 years. All subjects were right-handed, were scanned. We excluded 2 subjects, both male non-experts, from the analysis for clinical reasons. The experts were recruited from architectural offices and schools where they were graduate or postgraduate students. Non-experts were all undergraduate or graduate students with no formal education in any art-related field. Similarly to the previous decade, the key factors influencing the subject's supposed performance is formal education. Expertise is firmly rooted in specialized education. Graduate students of architecture as well as architecture professionals were considered as experts. We can see similar pattern in other above-mentioned studies, which also tend to define expertise in formal education terms solely. Although I think that the described development makes research in neuroaesthetics more connected with what at least some aestheticians might consider as thematically relevant for philosophical aesthetics, strong doubts remain. In the previous part, I put pressure on the idea that to avoid the situation in which one's knowledge replaces one's expertise, one needs to recruit subjects with no knowledge in the arts. I argued that the real problem did not consider knowledge per se, but the way knowledge was being used, and that the problem seems most relevant in a feeling under uncertainty condition that I allotted to naive appreciators forced to express aesthetic judgments. However, the turn to experts does not by itself guarantee that they will actually perform aesthetic appreciation in a scanner, that is, use what they know to guide their perception and not to replace it. The main reason for doubting about the psychology of naive subjects was their lack of confidence and uncertainty. Here one can suspect the opposite problem, that is, an overdose of confidence resulting in a quick assessment based on applying the right label rather than experiencing the work. Okay, so this is the application of the philosophical problem is not gotten rid of once you give people expertise. It's basically arguing that gut reaction does not count, or is not what, not that it doesn't count. It's that it's what the studies are tracking is not necessarily what the respondents, the test subjects, are doing, and they have not accounted for the difference between gut reaction and then reflection of the perception on their perception. And what they want to be doing is get the more sophisticated reflective understanding, not the gut check reaction to the images. Okay, so writing about moral experts, Bruce Weinstein coined a useful general distinction. He distinguished between the epistemic and performative expert. According to him, an epistemic expert is a person who is capable of providing strong justifications for a range of claims in a domain, and a performative expert is a person who is able to perform a skill well according to the rules and virtues of practice. He further argues that the two kinds of expertise are mutually independent. One is not reducible to the other. In visual neuroaesthetics since the 1990s, aesthetic experts are understood as simply the opposite of laypeople or aesthetically naive subjects, while a demarcation point between them is supposedly indicated by the presence or absence of formal education received at an art school. What Weinstein's distinction helps to question is the supposition that there's one skill only, running from aesthetically naive people to future artists. Both types that Weinstein distinguishes seem to have their clear incarnations in the aesthetic realm. An example of an epistemic expert would be an art historian who is able to say that, for instance, the newly discovered Da Vinci is, in fact, a forgery, arguing that the artist who painted it was right-handed. A performative expert, on the other hand, seems to be, well, the person who painted it, seems to be a violin player who is capable of closely following the most demanding score with an impression of effortlessness. This difference is ignored in the neuroaesthetic studies, and as a result, both kinds are put on a single scale. While naivety in arts is being mostly described in epistemic terms, the research subjects do supposedly lack knowledge in art history, art theory, etc. The expertise is usually coached in the performative terms. Experts are the ones who have been attending art schools, that is, trained to become professional artists. Although the distinction Weinstein coined for the realm of aesthetics seems to be well preserved in aesthetics, aesthetic appreciation presents some difficulties. At the beginning of the paper, I subscribed to the view that aesthetic perception belongs to the general category of knowledge. Further on, I said that what matters is not solely the contents of knowledge, but also the one way it employs it. Although I am well aware of the fact that... Thanks, Aristotle, by the way. Although I am well aware of the fact that these remarks are far from being satisfactory, I cannot elaborate on them in the scope of this paper. But even characterized in these crude terms, aesthetic perception clearly escapes classification under one of the general types of expertise distinguished by Bruce Weinstein. As an expert in aesthetic appreciation, one needs both sufficient knowledge of the arts, that is, some kind of expertise in the epistemic sense, and at the same time an ability to perform a certain skill well, namely apply mentioned knowledge in the right way. Let us recall the questions Hume famously asked in his essay. But where are such critics to be found? By what marks are they to be known? How does it distinguish them from pretenders? Neuroaestheticians who have been recruiting experts at art schools have implicitly answered the first one. The two remaining ones have not been even tackled yet. I should say not even been identified yet, really, by the folks. By identifying the collapse of the two categories of expertise, that is, an epistemic and performative one, in the case of an art appreciator, I attempted at opening the discussion about the second question. As a side effect, the assumption that an art degree will do to find an aesthetic expert has been problematized. That does not mean that neuroaesthetics should give up on aesthetic expertise. To find it and correctly instruct the research subjects might, however, prove to be more difficult than expected, and philosophers' help in the search, Hume's reservation notwithstanding, is needed. Okay, this was a fun essay. It's going on the sort of like, it's showing that some of these old distinctions from epistemology, like knowing how and knowing that, when they get turned, when coming into the aesthetic realm and in terms of expertise, so like to performing a skill well versus knowing who is capable of finding strong justification. This is knowing that, and then being able to perform a skill well is knowing how. So these are classic, I guess, I don't know, I can't remember where they started at the moment, but showing that that distinction when it comes to art has not been appreciated in sort of the science, and so we've got a confusion between two things here: who the subjects are and how they can appreciate art, and then also what sort of reaction are we getting. And then when you get that reaction of those people that you're studying, does that matter what kind of knowledge that they might have of art? Are they more of a know-how person, or are they a know that? Like, do they know the history of art, or can they just perform the art? Because, you know, some artists, they can't talk about the work, but they're great painters, and they're unbelievable painters, but asking them to talk about it is sort of like beside the point. You don't want them to talk about them, you just want them to do it. So they're not a critic, they are a painter. And so we've got two things going on here. We've got the way that people are reacting to art aesthetically, that people are trying to study, and then what kind of person there are. Have I read The Prince? Don't know what The Prince is, sorry, off the top of my head. I mean, there was like some little book about the prince, like a children's story, but no, I don't know. So I guess the point about this paper, though, is bringing up some interesting cases in terms of aesthetics and how we are to study it if you're going to do a scientific study of aesthetics. Because you can't just assume that people have no background, and then there are different kinds of backgrounds that matter here. Okay. So this, I guess this goes to both the experimental philosophy and neuroaesthetics, and also the epistemology of aesthetics too. So there's a fun paper. You have any questions out there in the viewing world? The winged hussars? Don't know. But thanks for stopping by. That's about it for this paper, though. I don't have too much to say because I think that this was also, I should make a comment on how was this argued. This was pretty well argued, reasonably. They set out to show some of the issues, and they started with the Plato, so the historical stuff is fine, even though they were talking about the neuroaesthetics and like modern science, but it set up the problem as a historical problem that was sort of not well appreciated by the experimenters. So it's sort of this like underlying issue on how do we understand what is being reacted to. Granted, that's always the case in experimental stuff, but the argument here is that it wasn't accounted for, and it's only starting to get accounted for. So the historical sort of like history is nice because it shows that this has been a subtlety is easy to overlook, and it's been overlooked forever. Then they transition to the epistemic stuff, and as a suggestion for how to correct the problem. And not a whole lot was said there, but it was just sort of, this is like the future research needs to go into this. How do you find an expert, and then how would you know such a person? And then how then can we study that person in a way that actually gets at the underlying thing that they want, which is the neurology of aesthetics. Okay, but yeah, that's it. Because that's all I can think of at the moment. Everyone else out there, have a good day. If there's no further questions, stay safe, y'all, and I'll be back again tonight, but then I usually take Mondays off, and I'll be back tonight and then again on Tuesday. Have a good day, everybody, and stay safe.